Hey guys, Modelling Weekly here. In this video, as hinted at last week, I'll be making a nice little frozen lake vignette to pair with my F19 Gloster Gladiator. I'll also be making a couple of figures and having some fun with snow effects, so I hope you enjoy it. In order to give the vignette a smart appearance, I picked up this lovely oak base on eBay, along with a couple of RAF figures which will instead be painted up with winter war uniforms, as I couldn't find any Swedish pilot figures. These will have to do. As the icy lake surface itself will be made by casting epoxy resin, the first order of business was sizing up the base and creating a mould with Fusion 360, which I could then slice and 3D print. I gathered all the measurements I needed with a vernier caliper and transferred them into Fusion. I began by creating a basic plan view outline, which I could then extrude to form a shallow basin into which the resin would be poured. Thanks to Fusion's high ease of use and simplified UI, this was a quick and easy process. Once complete, I exported the file as an STL into Cura, my preferred slicing software, and prepared it for printing on my Ender 5, a pretty reliable FDM printer. This took about 5 hours to complete, as I chose to print the mould on a raft so that I could easily remove it from the build plate later. A raft is essentially a 2-layer thick, low-density film that the printer adds in to separate the print and the build plate, reducing adhesion. This is important when you're printing something with a large surface area on the build plate. 5 hours later, here is the completed result. It's not too bad, though there are obviously layer lines that will be transferred to the cast later on. As a result, I'll have to sand down the areas where this is most prevalent on the final piece, but this isn't too big of an issue. Now for the resin itself. Today I'll be using Glass Cast 3, as the base isn't a deep pour, so it doesn't require anything that special. This stuff also has an initial cure time of 24 hours, so I'll be able to make some more progress pretty soon after pouring. I decided to also add a drop or two of Tamiya clear blue acrylic, just to give the resin a slightly blue, icy tinge. As suggested by the packaging, this, along with the resin and hardener, were mixed thoroughly for a good 3 or 4 minutes, ensuring that the resin would cure correctly without any soft patches. Glass cast requires a mixing ratio of 2 parts resin to 1 part hardener, so these measurements were weighed using a mass balance. It's almost time to pour. Before I go ahead with this, however, the mould needs a nice coating of Vaseline, which I could use as a makeshift release agent. Without adding this layer, the resin will almost certainly fuse with the mould, making it incredibly difficult to remove once it's cured. Once evenly coated, I added the resin. At this point there were a lot of bubbles present, however I did my best to remove them with an open flame in order to achieve a fairly respectable result. Whilst the resin cures, I'd just like to say a massive thanks to all of my Modelling Weekly channel members here on YouTube. Your support is absolutely invaluable, and I genuinely can't thank you all enough. If you'd like to find out more about what being a channel member entails, feel free to hit that join button down below for more info. Right, let's have a look at this cast. And it's not too bad. As expected, the layer lines on the base were transferred pretty noticeably to the resin, so these will need to be wet sanded to improve the appearance. Quite a big meniscus also formed around the edge, so this first had to be dealt with using a fresh hobby blade. Always cut away from yourself. I also noticed a few bubbles here and there that were obscured by the dark colour of the mould when I was pouring it, so I should probably have chosen a lighter colour. Tamiya sanding sponges of various grades were then used to deal with the texture on the underside. Water was added during this process to prevent the toxic resin dust from entering the air. I also wore a spray mask just in case. Unfortunately, I failed to remove some of the larger scratches created in the resin, so I just put these down to natural features in the ice. They'd be on the underside anyway, so it didn't matter too much. A glossy finish was returned to the resin using a bit of car polish, along with a microfiber cloth, as can be seen in the video. I then began working on giving the ice some simulated depth. Looking at reference images, frozen lakes seem to have a sort of streaking blue effect underneath the ice, so I attempted to recreate this using a variety of different blue shades on the bottom of the resin, gradually working from lights to darks with my airbrush. To start off with, I made use of AK's Blue Azure, as it has a nice mellow shade. Next up was a slightly more intense medium blue, Mr. Colour C323 in particular. All these streaks were painted in random directions to give the ice a more natural appearance. Finally, Tamiya Royal Blue finished off the effect, patching in any gaps left behind from before, whilst also simulating deep water. A hefty amount of CA glue from Everbuild was used to fix the resin onto the base plate, ensuring a strong hold. In hindsight, however, I probably should have used 2-part epoxy glue, as the ice ended up slightly separating from the base on one of the edges. Oops. It's looking good so far though. The surface was uncannily smooth at this point, so I gave it those characteristic ice scratches using some 120 grit sandpaper. The first snow effect that I made use of for this diorama was snow sprinkles from AK Interactive. This is a really interesting product. It comes in the form of an acrylic paste, so it can be blended and washed off with water. However, its appearance is almost crystalline. It almost perfectly simulates melted and partially frozen snow, serving as a perfect base layer onto which powder snow can be applied later on. I applied this in multiple layers with a brush in order to build up a nice effect, with thicker snow towards the edges of the diorama where the heat of the aircraft would not have reached and melted it. Next in line was AK's Snow Micro Balloons. The name of this product is slightly deceiving, as these so-called balloons are absolutely microscopic, and the product more closely resembles baking powder. This makes it perfect for simulating snow that has freshly fallen, or is yet to melt into the rest of the ground. Unlike snow sprinkles, it's obviously not self-adhesive, so required the addition of PVA glue before it could be applied. A spoon was used to achieve an even spread, along with a light tapping motion to ease the snow onto the ground. I really liked the look of this stuff. Excess could then simply be blown off using an empty airbrush. I took this moment to add the aircraft into the scene using CA glue so that it could be integrated into its environment more effectively. The gaps that I had left in the snow for the Gladiator's snowshoes was slightly too big, so I ended up having to patch these in slightly with some more snow sprinkles. I also took this opportunity to beef up some other areas. That's about it for the base itself, so let's have a crack at some figures. These were initially primed using Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black, providing a nice uniform surface onto which shading and colours could be applied. Flat white was then loaded into the airbrush and sprayed onto the figures from above, providing a quick and easy pre-shading layer. Looking into reference pictures, it wasn't entirely obvious what the pilot's uniform's colour should have been, as each image I looked at gave me a different result. Not to mention the fact that colours are hard to identify in black and white. As a result, I went for a camo green jacket with his trousers and flying gear in black. The paint was added in glaze-like layers in order to allow the effects of the pre-shading to show through. This was an effect I nabbed from Night Shift, so cheers to him for this. Painting with straight up black is never a good idea, as it is far too harsh against other colours, so a dark grey shade was mixed in order to paint the areas that would have been black in real life. Throughout this process, I made use of a wet palette in order to ensure that the colours I mixed would last the entire painting process. Feel free to check out the video I have on this handy bit of kit over on my channel. I then went about adding some highlights to our little pilot, starting with a lighter grey for his trousers, headgear and life jacket. These were focused around all of the raised areas on the uniform, which were fairly easy to pick out thanks to the incredible casting job that PJ Production has done on this guy. The same was then done to his jacket, this time making use of lightened camo green instead of the grey tone. All areas of exposed flesh were added with brown sand and highlights picked out with flat flesh. All of the same process were then applied to the mechanic as well, except his uniform was entirely black instead. And here they are. They were never going to be jaw-dropping given the scale, but I'd say they're fairly acceptable for all intents and purposes. Almost forgot the engine cowlings. These were quickly painted up with Mr. Super Metallic gunmetal and superglued into place next to the engine of the Gladiator. Now for the figures, which were also applied to the scene using superglue. I'd say they pretty successfully liven it all up a bit. The final order of business was to add a few random footprints in the snow using the foot taken from the pilot included in the original Airfix kit, mounted onto a cocktail stick. The snow sprinkles took quite a while to dry, so this allowed for slight indentations to be made, giving the Dio a bit of extra life. So here we have it, the completed vignette / diorama, whatever it technically is. For what was meant to just be a bit of fun, I'm fairly happy with the result, if I may say. Whilst it's not the most jaw-dropping diorama out there, as I'm sure there are some much nicer versions made by others, I think it successfully gives some life to an otherwise isolated model, and tells somewhat of a story at the same time. In terms of appearance, I'm very happy with the outcome of the snowy ice itself, as I think the effect I was after was well captured in this respect. The figures also weren't half bad. The only real reservation I have up to this point is the colour scheme of the aircraft itself. I'm still not very happy with the silver elements, and it overall doesn't really fit into its intensely white surroundings, making it look sort of out of place. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on the final product down below though, so feel free to leave a comment down there. That's it from me today, so a big thanks goes out yet again to all of my channel members, along with all of you guys for watching me this far. I really hope you enjoyed this one and stay tuned for next week's video. See you then.